I have watched enough historical transitions to recognize when a fundamental assumption stops being true. The assumption that defined North American power for 80 years, from the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944 to the spring of 2025, was simple and seemingly unbreakable. Canada needs the United States more than the United States needs Canada. Geographic proximity equals economic dependence. Shared borders guarantee aligned interests. This assumption was never questioned because it never needed to be questioned, until it did. What happened between February and April of 2025 was not a trade dispute. It was not a diplomatic disagreement. It was the quiet, irreversible termination of a relationship structure that had persisted through the entire post-war era. And the remarkable thing, the thing that reveals how profoundly the ground had shifted, is that this termination was not orchestrated by governments or negotiated in diplomatic chambers. It emerged from millions of individual decisions made by ordinary citizens who simply concluded that the costs of maintaining the relationship now exceeded its benefits. I am speaking about $4.2 billion in economic activity that ceased flowing across the longest undefended border in the world. I am speaking about 68% of an entire national population making purchasing choices that collectively severed patterns established over 3 generations. This was not organized protest. This was not coordinated resistance. This was something far more significant. This was the behavioral manifestation of a psychological break that, once it occurs at the population level, cannot be reversed through policy adjustments or leadership changes. The trigger, everyone knows, was the tariff package announced by the Trump administration in early 2025. 25% on lumber, steel, and agricultural products. 15% on energy exports. These were not minor trade adjustments. These were acts of economic aggression designed to extract concessions and demonstrate dominance. But the critical error, the miscalculation that revealed how completely American strategists had misread their own position, occurred when the administration invoked Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act. Section 232 allows the United States to impose tariffs on imports that threaten national security. Think carefully about what it means to classify Canadian aluminum and steel as security threats. You are telling your largest trading partner, your military ally in every significant conflict since 1917, the nation with which you share a border that has not seen military conflict in over 2 centuries, that their basic industrial production represents a danger to your survival. This was not economic policy. This was the language used to describe adversaries. This was rhetoric reserved for nations you're preparing to economically isolate or militarily confront. The assumption in Washington was that Canada would respond according to historical precedent. Diplomatic negotiations, measured concessions on dairy markets or pharmaceutical pricing, perhaps some symbolic retaliation followed by a return to normal patterns. This assumption was built on 80 years of observing Canadian behavior, which had consistently prioritized stability over confrontation, economic integration over independence, and partnership with the United States over alternatives that might threaten that partnership. But something fundamental had shifted in the Canadian population that American policymakers completely failed to detect. The shift did not happen suddenly in February 2025. It had been building for years, invisible to those who were not looking for it. The 2008 financial crisis had demonstrated that American economic management was not infallible. The first Trump administration had shown that trade agreements could be weaponized for domestic political purposes. The pandemic had revealed that supply chain integration with the United States created vulnerabilities rather than security. And now, facing tariffs that explicitly classified Canadian industry as a national security threat, all of these accumulated doubts found expression. The data from March 2025 tells a story that requires no interpretation. Canadian travel to the United States collapsed by 37% in a single month. Cross-border shopping, a ritual for millions of families living within 2 hours of American retail centers, simply stopped. The Abacus data polling firm documented that 68% of Canadians plan to avoid American goods and services for at least 18 months. But more significantly, 43% indicated they had no intention of returning to previous purchasing patterns, regardless of future policy changes. This was not a temporary protest. This was a permanent behavioral shift. The immediate impact on American border communities was devastating and immediate. Bellingham, Washington, a city whose retail economy had been constructed around Canadian shopping traffic, saw mall foot traffic decline by over 60% within 6 weeks. Hotels in border states reported occupancy rates falling to levels not seen since the 2008 financial crisis. Municipal tax revenues collapsed. Businesses that had operated successfully for decades suddenly faced insolvency. These were not abstract macroeconomic statistics. These were communities watching their economic foundations disintegrate in real time. But the structural damage extended far beyond retail and tourism. The energy sector, which American policymakers had treated as a permanent source of American leverage over Canadian policy, became the mechanism through which American consumers paid the price for their government's miscalculation. Canada supplies 4.3 million barrels of oil per day to the United States. This is not generic commodity oil that can be sourced from alternative suppliers. This is heavy crude specifically designed for the refining infrastructure of the American Midwest and Gulf Coast. These refineries represent hundreds of billions of dollars in capital investment optimized for Canadian heavy crude. They cannot simply switch to lighter domestic shale oil without massive retrofitting that would require years and cost tens of billions of dollars. When the 15% tariff was imposed on Canadian energy, the assumption in Washington was that Canadian producers, desperate to maintain market access, would absorb the cost. This assumption demonstrated a complete failure to understand how energy markets actually function. Refineries in Michigan, Ohio, Illinois, and Wisconsin saw their input costs spike by $18 per barrel overnight. They did not absorb this cost. They could not absorb this cost without immediately becoming unprofitable. They passed the cost directly to consumers. By summer 2025, drivers in swing states were paying an additional 41 cents per gallon for gasoline solely because of the Canadian energy tariff. This was not theoretical economic modeling. This was a political disaster unfolding in real time in states that determined presidential elections. Republican governors in Ohio and Michigan publicly broke with the administration. The American Trucking Association, representing an industry that moves over $738 billion in goods annually, issued formal statements calling the tariff policy economically suicidal. When your own party's elected officials are openly contradicting your signature economic policy, when industry groups that typically support your political coalition are calling your decisions disastrous, you have created a problem that cannot be managed through communication strategy or rhetorical escalation. While Washington struggled with the domestic political consequences of its own tariff policy, something far more consequential was occurring in Ottawa. Following Justin Trudeau's resignation in early 2025, Canada appointed Mark Carney as Prime Minister. This was not a conventional political choice. Carney is not a career politician. He is a central banker who guided Canada through the 2008 financial crisis as governor of the Bank of Canada without a single bank failure, then became the first non-British person to serve as governor of the Bank of England in its 319-year history. This is someone who understands financial architecture, leverage dynamics, and strategic positioning at a level that simply does not exist in contemporary American political leadership. Carney's response was not emotional retaliation. It was not Twitter diplomacy or press conference grandstanding. It was a comprehensive restructuring of Canadian economic strategy designed to function independently of American approval. The centerpiece was a $1.2 trillion sovereignty investment program announced in the 2025 federal budget. This was not deficit spending for social programs or political constituencies. This was strategic capital expenditure designed to permanently alter Canada's economic dependencies and create alternatives that had not previously existed. The investment program allocated $340 billion over 5 years to build east-west trade corridors that would bypass American markets entirely. Another $280 billion went to critical minerals processing, ensuring that Canada would add value to resources domestically rather than shipping raw materials south for processing and then importing finished goods at premium prices. But the most audacious component, the one that revealed Carney understood that geography itself could be weaponized, was $180 billion committed to the Arctic Gateway Initiative centered on the port of Churchill in Manitoba. Churchill had been dismissed for decades as economically irrelevant, a remote northern outpost with seasonal ice conditions that made it impractical for major commercial shipping operations. But Carney recognized something that American strategists had completely missed. Churchill is the only deepwater Arctic port in North America with direct rail connection to the continental transportation network. And as climate change progressively opens northern shipping routes, Churchill becomes potentially the most strategically valuable port on the continent. The geometry is simple and undeniable. A cargo ship traveling from Hamburg to Winnipeg saves 6,400 kilometers by routing through Churchill rather than traditional routes through the St. Lawrence, Seaway, or American ports. That translates to 12 days of reduced transit time and approximately $620,000 in fuel cost savings per voyage. In an industry where profit margins are measured in pennies per ton, this represents revolutionary competitive advantage. And unlike the Panama Canal or Suez Canal, which can be blocked by hostile powers or disabled by single-point failures, the Arctic routes pass entirely through Canadian territorial waters. By September 2025, the first post-Panamax container ship docked in Churchill, loaded with Canadian wheat destined for Germany. The symbolism was unmistakable and deliberate. Canada was demonstrating that North American trade no longer required American infrastructure, American ports, or American approval. The market response was immediate. Canadian wheat futures jumped 23% as European buyers recognized they could source directly from Canada without American intermediaries or American political risk. Potash prices, where Canada controls nearly half of global reserves, spiked 31% as fertilizer companies scrambled to secure supply agreements that bypassed American territory. But Carney's strategy extended far beyond infrastructure investment. While the Trump administration was systematically alienating traditional American allies through unpredictable policy shifts and rhetorical hostility, Canada was building what can only be described as a coalition of the economically abandoned. Comprehensive trade agreements were signed with the European Union worth $244 billion, integrating Canadian companies into European defense supply chains. This was not simply commerce. This was Canada signaling that if the United States continued its retreat from NATO commitments, Canada possessed alternative security relationships. The Asia-Pacific strategy was equally sophisticated and equally revealing of long-term strategic thinking. Bilateral trade deals with Indonesia, Vietnam, and Thailand specifically targeted the 700 million person ASEAN market with combined GDP exceeding $4.8 trillion. The message embedded in these agreements was unmistakable. Canadian resources, Canadian agricultural products, Canadian manufactured goods could reach global markets without requiring transit through American-controlled infrastructure or settlement through American financial systems. Even the relationship with China, which had been strained for years over diplomatic disputes and security concerns, was recalibrated with surgical precision. Without endorsing China's political system or compromising on fundamental values, Canada positioned itself as a pragmatic middle power willing to maintain economic relationships with all major powers while serving as strategic proxy for none. This neutrality, which would have been impossible to maintain under the previous model of Canadian-American integration, became valuable precisely because it offered Chinese companies access to North American resources without the political complications of dealing directly with an increasingly hostile United States. The results by the end of 2025 speak with a clarity that transcends political interpretation. Canadian exports to the European Union increased 34% year over year. Exports to Asia rose 28%. Meanwhile, American agricultural exports declined as international buyers found alternative suppliers who did not subject them to unpredictable tariff changes and political hostility. The most significant indicator came from private equity and institutional investment flows. Foreign direct investment in Canadian logistics and infrastructure jumped 340% in the final quarter of 2025. Global capital was making a judgment about the future distribution of economic power in North America, and that judgment heavily favored Canada. I want to emphasize something that should be obvious, but apparently requires explicit statement. Leverage in international relations is not determined by the size of your economy, the strength of your military, or the sophistication of your financial markets. Leverage is determined by alternatives. For 80 years, from 1945 to 2025, the United States maintained dominance over Canadian policy because Canada had no meaningful alternatives, no alternative markets of comparable size. No alternative supply chains, no alternative infrastructure for reaching global customers. That monopoly no longer exists, and once monopoly power is broken, it cannot be restored through negotiation or policy adjustment. The timing of Carney's comprehensive strategy becomes clear when you understand that all of these economic maneuvers, all of this diplomatic repositioning, all of this infrastructure investment was building toward a single date, July 1st, 2026. This is the mandatory review date for the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement, when all three countries must decide whether to renew the trade framework for another 16 years. Trump had viewed this date as a weapon, assuming that 18 months of tariffs and economic pressure would bring Canada and Mexico to the negotiating table, desperate for any deal that restored market access. Instead, as the review date approached, the panic became visible, not in Ottawa or Mexico City, but in Washington. The December 2025 United States Trade Representative hearings were supposed to validate the administration's tough negotiating stance. Instead, they became a corporate revolt. Over 3 days of testimony, 147 American business leaders appeared before Congress, begging the administration not to destroy trade relationships that their companies depended on for survival. The American Apple Association warned that losing Canadian market access would bankrupt thousands of farms across multiple states. The Automotive Policy Council demonstrated that individual automotive parts cross the U.S.-Canada border an average of 7 times during production, meaning a 25% tariff at each crossing would add over $1,400 to the cost of every American-made vehicle. Ford Motor Company cited supply chain disruptions from Canadian tariffs as responsible for $1.4 billion in losses in a single fiscal year. General Motors announced the closure of 2 Michigan assembly plants specifically due to the increased cost of Canadian steel and aluminum components. These were not abstract economic projections. These were announced plant closures, documented job losses, and publicly reported financial damage directly attributable to the administration's tariff policy. Trade economists began drawing explicit historical parallels. Lawrence Summers, former Treasury Secretary and former president of Harvard University, noted that the situation bore disturbing resemblance to the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930, which triggered retaliatory tariffs globally and deepened what became the Great Depression. What Carney has demonstrated, Summers wrote in a widely circulated analysis, is what happens when you give a sophisticated modern economy 18 months' notice that it needs to build alternatives to American economic integration. You should not then be surprised when they successfully build those alternatives and conclude they no longer need to accept subordinate status. This observation captures the fundamental miscalculation. When you force a capable, resource-rich, technologically advanced economy to choose between submission and independence, and then provide them with sufficient time to build the infrastructure and relationships necessary for independence, you should expect them to choose independence. The Canadian steel mill that spent 6 months getting certified as a supplier for German automotive manufacturers will not abandon that relationship simply because a new American administration offers to remove tariffs. The logistics infrastructure built to ship grain through Churchill to European markets will not be dismantled because Washington decides to return to previous trade terms. Economic relationships, once severed, do not simply resume because political leadership changes. Trust in international commerce is the most valuable and most fragile currency. When you classify your trading partner's industrial production as a national security threat, when you weaponize trade policy for domestic political purposes, when you treat partnership as subordination, you fundamentally damage trust in ways that cannot be repaired through subsequent negotiation. What I am describing is not the collapse of American power. That characterization would be too dramatic and too simple. What I am describing is the end of a specific model of American dominance that had functioned effectively for 80 years. The model assumed that geographic proximity to the United States, combined with economic integration, would guarantee policy alignment and strategic subordination. This model worked when there were no alternatives. It fails completely once alternatives exist. The $4.2 billion boycott was not the cause of this transformation. It was the symptom. It was the visible manifestation of a psychological break that had been developing for years and finally found expression when millions of individual Canadians made independent decisions about where to shop, where to travel, and which products to purchase. When populations make that kind of psychological break, when they internalize that separation is not only possible but perhaps preferable, governments inevitably follow. Political leadership does not create these shifts. Political leadership responds to them. By the time American policymakers understood what had occurred, the opportunity for reversal had already passed. You cannot restore trust through diplomatic statements. You cannot rebuild severed supply chains through trade negotiations. The infrastructure Canada built, the relationships Canada forged, the alternatives Canada created, these are permanent features of North American economic geography now. They will persist regardless of which political party controls government in either country. History does not evaluate governments based on their stated intentions or their rhetorical commitments to particular principles. History evaluates outcomes. And the outcome of the 2025 tariff strategy was not enhanced American leverage over Canadian policy. The outcome was Canadian economic independence backed by alternative markets, alternative infrastructure, and alternative relationships that eliminate the monopoly power the United States had exercised for 80 years. What follows from this is not mysterious or unpredictable. It is already visible in trade statistics, investment flows, and diplomatic alignments. Canada will continue diversifying away from dependence on American markets. Other middle powers will observe this strategy, recognize its success, and adapt similar approaches to their own circumstances. The assumption that American economic coercion will produce compliance will be tested repeatedly in various contexts, will fail repeatedly, and will eventually be abandoned as unworkable. I am not predicting future events. I am describing momentum that is already irreversible. The $4.2 billion boycott did not create this momentum. It revealed that the momentum already existed and had reached the point where it could express itself through mass behavioral change without coordination or central planning. That is the moment when historical transitions become irreversible. Not when governments make formal decisions, but when populations collectively decide that previous patterns no longer serve their interests. 80 years of American dominance over Canadian policy ended not with a treaty or diplomatic crisis, but with millions of Canadians deciding independently that the relationship had become more costly than beneficial. And once that decision is made at the population level, once it is internalized and acted upon through countless individual choices, it cannot be reversed through policy adjustment or leadership change. By the time most people understand what occurred, it will no longer matter whether they approve. The structure has already changed. The alternatives already exist. The monopoly has already been broken. What remains is simply watching the consequences unfold over years and decades as the new structure replaces the old one completely. This is how dominance ends, not with dramatic confrontation, but with quiet, irreversible decisions made by populations who conclude that the old arrangements no longer serve them. History only records the outcome.